It's fantastic. On examination of the skull of Mr. Adams, I noticed two small holes in the base of the occipital region here. They penetrated to the medulla oblongata where the spinal cord meets the brain. I opened the skull to investigate and found this.
The brain, it's gone.
Yes. Sucked out like an egg through those two holes.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I'm your host, Ian Garcia, and with me, as always, is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
We're in our Bad Brains month. Last week, we did the rather pulpy, but still thoroughly enjoyable The Brain from Planet Arrows. This week, we're doing our second, well, I guess technically our third, but the second one that we're actually going to be thoroughly covering, our second British entry into the saga of classic B movies, the 1958 film Fiend Without a Face. It has a certain cult following, but it seems to me that I can't for the life of me figure out the reason why that is. I wasn't particularly fond of the movie. I think I was amused by it, but it seems like the tremendous amount of its cult following tends to come from its stop motion special effects, which is, you know, the Fiend itself is like this. It spends most of the movie invisible, but then it when it becomes visible, it turns out to be this brain with like a central nervous system that it uses as like a arm to crawl with, and it has two antennae, and it leaps around and latches onto people and sucks out their brain and spinal matter. But even as far as the special effects, I thought those were they were kind of terrible. Like, I did notice discreetly during one of the shots where the brain is crawling through the underbrush, you can see the twigs and the leaves moving around it, even when the brain isn't touching the leaves, because apparently the animator was accidentally moving a lot of the set pieces around and apparently didn't really have enough time to, like, get a more convincing effect.
Right.
Like, I don't know, like, what are your thoughts of it now, seeing it again?
First of all, I think that in terms of the use of file footage, it was done pretty well. So the file footage was
a lot of stock
sparse.
footage. Yeah,
It was sparse, and it was seemed to be, as opposed to other films where the stock footage got to be overplayed so much just to extend the movie.
Yeah.
Here, at least, it was edited sufficiently that I thought it was reasonable.
There's even some use of a different use of application of stock footage technique where they ADR'd or dubbed in dialogue to imply that the people in the stock footage are, you know, carrying on conversations with the
actors,
real actors.
Yeah. But I think when you now look at the movie, you know, in terms of dialogue and plot sequence, and there are some contrivances.
Yeah.
That seem to move the plot along for no apparent reason. They come up with these ideas or beliefs. For example, all of a sudden, I think Dr. So-and-so is involved somehow.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reclusive doctor, a reclusive Dr. Walgate, played by Keaniston Reeves, and it basically turns out that this whole movie takes place in a town on the American-Canadian border where there's an American military base which is using experimental radiation energy as part of a radar experiment that they're basically implicitly going to be using to monitor the Russians and to make sure that they're not gonna get sneaky and send a few war or spy or bombers over the Arctic Circle to come get us. But then it turns out that there's this Professor Walgate who experiments predominantly in aspects of telepathy and brain brain science, basically. It's like very, very pseudo-scientific stuff, but he basically develops a means of amplifying his brain energy in order to move objects, but apparently in the process of so doing, the mixture between these experiments and the radiation produced at the military base gives rise to these autonomous, self-reproducing brain monsters that just start vampirically feasting upon the whole town.
Like I said, the plots are pretty good in and of themselves, and a lot of the deaths look pretty decent. I mean, in terms of
Yeah, it's sort of like a parallel to there's definitely certain parallels to, again, the last British movie we covered, the Quatermass Experiment. Not so much in terms of the plot, but in terms of this melding of a sort of classic gothic horror approach to the storyline with a sort of modern science fiction trappings, because obviously a big draw of the movie is just the brain monsters and these awful goings on produced by radiation and by mad science, but there's also the way they characterize the monsters is as mental vampires, so you already have elements of vampirism, and then of course the idea of telepathy. There's all sorts of supernatural implications in it, and I think in a certain way, like, I think for British films of the time, it seemed like this is mostly a function of the fact that in the United States, the sort of hard sci-fi is a much more coherent and consistently plotted genre, whereas the British filmmakers who were behind this film, or it's also like with Kaltiki, the Immortal Monster, the Italian film we saw, where there's this ambiguity in terms of the national horror and science fiction cinema that begins popping up outside of the United States, where the ambiguity is you want to create something within a specific genre, but there's always almost this inherent prejudice of culture against the idea that that the British know anything about science fiction movies, and with the British especially, there's also seemingly this implication of an anti-American bias, where it's like, these are the sorts of trash that Americans make, the sort of gruesome, gratuitous schlock that they use to pander to people, but that British audiences should be above. And I think listening to the audio commentary by the executive producer of the film, Jim Gordon, that was especially fortuitous for the DVD to have an audio commentary with the producer, because he seems to spell out precisely that sort of ambiguity, although I don't think he's necessarily that critical or conscious of it. It just sort of is the way it is, that this was a British film, but which was produced primarily for the American market. So it takes place in North America. The stars are mainly American actors. And so it sort of has this implication. So there's this sort of strange economics of it, where it's not so much that it's a dyed-in-wool British film, not even like the Quatermass Experiment could be said to be, but it is very much almost like an outsourced labor in a low-budget film context. Maybe I should just describe, like, the, just sort of the behind-the-scenes of the movie. Not Jim Gordon. The producer's name is Richard Gordon, and, Fiend Without a Face was it was one of a package of horror films that he produced between 1958 and 1959. He was based in the United States, but the method that he used to produce movies was basically to strike... He was the head of a American distribution company, and he would strike deals with British producers in order to make these low-budget films that could then be packaged and sold both in the United Kingdom and the United States. And so in in the same span of 2 years that The Fiend Without a Face was made, basically back to back, he also made a Boris Karloff movie called The Haunted Strangler, Corridors of Blood, which I have seen and is actually a very good movie. And First Man into Space would actually see the star of The Fiend Without a Face, Marshall Thompson, also starring in that movie. As far as Richard Gordon himself, he formed the production company for the film Amalgamated Productions in 1956. He was only 31 years old when he started doing this, and he had basically been working in the distribution of foreign films since he was in his 20s. And there's this parallel which is occurring between companies like Amalgamated and also evolving companies like American International Pictures, where it is again that process of this is just one of the mechanisms through which you keep overhead costs low in order to maximize profits, where again you contract independent producers in one country to make a movie specifically for another market. And I think for the British film industry, it was a particularly fortuitous one, because unlike in the United States, there was at least a much more robust state-run public investment in commercial cinema during that time. So I think something that Richard Gordon touches upon in the audio commentary is that by law in the United Kingdom at the time, is if an independent producer could put up 70% of the production costs for a movie, then as long as the script was approved by the state film registry, the state itself would also kick in the rest of the 30%. So in a way, like, it's almost, these are not just outsourced movies, they're also partially publicly funded in a really weird way. And it gets even weirder because despite the fact that it is technically, or even because it is a publicly funded film, apparently Fiend Without a Face was quite controversial in the United Kingdom. Just like the Quatermass Experiment, it also received an X certificate, which means that, again, we're seeing an example of a film that in the United States context, where they only have the Production Code Authority seal, which basically means we approve or disapprove of it. You either get the seal, which says that you can be shown in major theaters throughout the country, or you don't have the seal and you basically completely close off a lot of the marketing and distribution options for the movie. But there's no graduated rating system. There's no system of specific movies being appropriate for specific ages yet, whereas in the United Kingdom, the X certificate, as funny as it is now looking at the film, because it is still pretty tame. I don't think it's nearly as gruesome as the Quatermass Experiment.
No, it's not. No.
But it nonetheless was given an X certificate, which basically means that as far as the UK censors were concerned, that this was a movie that was only appropriate to be seen by adults or minors accompanied by adults. And apparently it was even brought up in the House of Parliament, like after its premiere. Its controversy was enough that, that there was some unnamed member of the House of Parliament had brought it up as a specific example of the exact kind of movies that public money should not be going to fund. And it really is odd, because I guess the movie has its gruesome parts, but all of those most gruesome parts all involve violence against the brains, where, the stop motion brains will be like shot by a gun and then blood will pool out of their heads. I think at one point one is killed with an axe. And that's a pretty gruesome shot. But overall, it seems to be, again, this sort of cultural difference where the same thing that counted against the Quatermass Experiment more so than necessarily the explicit violence is the gothic elements and the fixation upon agony, because it's almost disappointing in the way when the brains themselves are actually revealed, because before that all you really have is this invisible force, and then these actors performing as if they're dying in some agonizing way. And I think, those are definitely where the movie shines the most, because you do have just this kind of hokey but nonetheless rather convincing scenario where you have these people who are just in the grips of the knowledge that they're being killed and they're about to die, and they just drop dead, and there's not really any. Mm-hmm. And it's a very morbid film in that regard. I think that the revealing of the monsters takes away from that in more ways than one, but you could see how this emphasis again on suffering, this emphasis on people being destroyed or having their bodies invisibly mutilated, even if you don't see it represented explicitly to a certain censor at a certain time, that could be enough to say this is absolutely not appropriate for children to be seeing.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. It's obviously not appropriate for children, especially, if anything, the sexist scenes for sure aren't appropriate for children.
That's the hard irony, is that the stuff that is the most unacceptable today is the stuff that they probably weren't even thinking about.
It would have been better if they would have used like they do with the Invisible Man, or like they did with the Kevin Bacon movie, where you throw something on them and they like dust or something, and you see their form.
Right.
That's harder to do, though, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
Because invisible camera work is a lot harder to do than you still have to do the stop motion, right?
Right.
So, but that would be cooler. Like you said, I think the invisible aspect of the killing is more tantalizing and more intriguing than when they become, all of a sudden they boost the power so high they become visible. Yeah. Well, that doesn't make any freaking sense.
Yeah, it's not really.
It's counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is exactly like you suggested before, where it seems like this senseless contrivance. Where they had
to, right?
Well, they didn't have to. I think they did it because they wanted to show the brain that's going to appear on the poster.
Right.
Or
what I'm trying to say.
I think they have a very lowest common denominator assessment of the audience, which is that, all right, the audience is going to want to see the monster. They're not going to take invisible people miming being attacked by invisible menaces.
Right, but think of where it does work. For example, the Tingler, which could be put into this genre where it's a spinal cord or a spine animal that grows out of fear. It's a great concept. And that's a really great movie.
Yeah, I like The Tingler a lot.
The Tingler is well done. And so, but there are ways you could have done it more effectively. I think it's just a bad movie all around. Although, I mean, even with the bad stop motion, I'm not even talking about this. Just they could have done better with it, within budget.
Yeah,
still within
just
budget.
Plot-wise, it is a very mercenary movie.
Right, they could have gone even within budget. They could have done a better job with it. It's just a matter of it comes down to the script, right?
I think what it really is that the implication. So, during the climax of the movie, basically what's happened is that.
Oh, here's another thing. That's another.
Wait.
Explain that.
Well, I'll roll into it, but
ridiculous.
So the first thing that's a real contrivance, as far as that it's just as the radiation grows, the brains get stronger. But as a result of this, the radiation grows to the point where the monsters are no longer invisible. They attain a totally visible material form. But then you think to yourself, well, wait, that's, like you said, that's counterproductive. The brain isn't made stronger by having a physical form.
Right.
Wouldn't more radiation make it more terrifying in the sense that, I don't know, maybe now it can teleport instead of having to crawl and leap around to places? It is just a contrivance just to get the brains revealed. But
there is a good point. There are a couple good scenes, just to interject, there are a couple good scenes at work where we know the brains actually destroy the equipment that is meant to curtail the radiation.
Yeah, they're very clever. We were definitely making some aliens jokes as we were watching the movie. That
when they light the fuse, even though the fuse wouldn't, you can explain that later. But the animal tries to jump to knock the fuse out, but it misses and doesn't get it. or just taps it and it still manages to go off. And look, good. You can explain the rest, but that's
Right.
contrivance too, as I explained.
Yeah, like the monster, like you can, like I think the monsters themselves are interestingly presented because they, on the one hand, they are sort of this classical hive mind creature. Like there's potentially hundreds of them, but they all think with one.
Right.
With one consciousness, but that it becomes, you know.
Well, they're all clones, aren't they?
Right.
So they have all one thinking. Since they're clones of that the initial creature that escaped somehow from its stupid laboratory.
But it's suggested that they have like a full consciousness, like they're not ignorant of the fact that they depend on the radiation to survive. So they do eventually go to the base, the power plant where the radiation is being produced in order to. Basically to promote a meltdown. And that's the other thing, is that like there's this, that's another thing that doesn't really work about the movie, is that it can't get its ticking clock straight, because you already have in the climax, you know, the hero is, you know, everyone's bunkered down in the house of the scientist and they're, you know, fighting off the brain monsters, they're all swarming in on them, but then there's this parallel ticking clock of, you have this radiation plant which is, you know, basically going into meltdown
right,
mode. It's not being regulated.
Yes, it's overheated. It's a China syndrome.
Yeah, yes. So presumably there's also these brains are trying to affect like a total radiation leak so that they can like thrive even more.
Yeah.
But like it doesn't seem, but the movie itself, it's weird that radiation is part of the problem in the movie, but it doesn't seem to place a particularly high premium on the actual threat of radiation, which I think shows where the film is at ideologically, but it also goes back to what you alluded to before, which is that, so because you now have this ticking clock with the power plant about to melt down, you then have to have the hero make a break for it to go to the power plant to try to stop the meltdown, but
unimpeded.
Unimpeded. Yeah, he doesn't he doesn't get a lot of pushback from the brains themselves. Like it's rather anticlimactic. But basically his only plan is to just destroy the control panels of the plant. And as we were talking about, is that okay, so this is clearly written by somebody who is under the misapprehension that radiation is like burning coal,
or like turning off a light,
turning off a light. Yeah, it's like that. Like, okay, well, if you destroy the control panel, then the radiation will stop because it's like flipping a switch, and it's like, well, no, because if you destroy the control panel, then you're going to ensure that there's going to be a meltdown, because then there's nothing controlling the outflow of radiation.
Well, what were they trying to do? They were trying to ship in cadmium control rods from someplace. It wasn't enough time, right?
Yeah, because that's another thing. The brains off-screen sometimes destroy the cadmium control rods. So yeah, they're deliberately trying to start a meltdown. But yeah, so like the entire climax rests on the hero doing something that would absolutely not stop a meltdown, because again, like you said, it's not like, because whoever wrote this script is thinking of this power plant not in terms of being the place where the energy begins, but as the place it's transmitted. So like you said, like if you just turn off a light or you cut a line, the power will stop being transmitted. No. But it's really more comparable to if the monsters thrived on burning oil, and so you decided to literally go bomb an oil field in order to stop the chain reaction.
Exactly. That's exactly what it's like, which has no bearing on the...
Yeah, it has absolutely no bearing on the
Which is, that kills the whole thing. Of course, when you're younger, you don't know anything about radiation. And you don't know
you just know that it's a thing that does... that makes brain monsters.
Yeah, and so the script, I mean, I don't know. How would you have the ending? You know, it really is interesting when you think about it.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. They couldn't have possibly had a dark ending where the brains just take over.
It's because the script is poorly written, and
it even does that thing. And I think we've seen it like a million times now, where it does end with the hero holding a woman and saying it's all over.
Jeff, I thought that...
It's okay, honey.
It's all over.
Oh my
You know,
God.
it's like it seems
and,
like
and I
it
once,
comes up
but
over.
Twice.
Yeah,
glad
he does.
to see you have things in hand. Right
Yeah,
now.
exactly. Oh my God, yeah. There's also okay. We'll get into the weird sexual politics of it later. I think
horrible. It made me crawl.
We'll get into the weird the weird kind of perviness of the movie. But I did want to cycle back because it wasn't all for naught. I think the movie was amusing in certain respects.
It's amusing, yes.
But I think the thing
how about the guns? We have to
talk. Oh no, we'll get to that later. Again, we'll get into the things that I think one thing I did want to notice, it wasn't a total loss just because I discovered.
So let me ask you a question. How much is this related to the book by The Thought Monster? I mean, there's no radiation in The Thought Monster. It's too early.
Right? So that's the thing. The movie is an adaptation of a short story written by Amelia Reynolds Long, which was published in the magazine Weird Stories in 1930. And the story, The Thought Monster, like you said, because it's written in 1930, it has there's no references to radiation. It is strictly a story about this scientist who develops a method of extending his brain energy, but in the process creates these mental vampires.
So it takes corporeal form.
Right, yeah. And that was another thing we maybe should have touched upon, is like the parallels between the premise of The Fiend Without a Face and the earlier, much better movie Forbidden Planet, which is, of course, all about a scientist who...
blame from Planet Eris. Right?
Well, the brain for Planet Eris, I mean, I guess you could say, like, but that's more of a symbolic thing, where, like, the brain is symbolically animated.
But like you mentioned before, that the brain gets into his head and enjoys the sexual tension.
I think we're getting
too far away.
I think that's true. I think we're getting to a common motif of these brain movies, where the brain itself is sort of a representation of, like, the dark...
The id,
the unconscious primal death drive and perversions of whoever manifests them. But as far as the Thought Monster itself,
I'm sorry, you said something about the Forbidden Planet. What were you going to say?
No, it was only to make that point, that there's obviously parallels to the Forbidden Planet in terms of the plot of a scientist who, in his quest for greater knowledge, only ends up unlocking the key to the darkest aspects of himself. Right. And I guess we could say that, like, I guess the common thread through those as well is what I refer to as scientophobia, which is the irrational fear of science. And it's something that you see a lot in classical science fiction that has a sort of bend of social commentary or conservative moralism, where despite the fact that this entire genre is kind of predicated on this idea of scientific speculation and even sort of naive awe at the rate of technological and scientific expansion, that very often these narratives themselves orient themselves around a deep fear of science itself, you know, in the most, like, distilled way, basically being the idea of, like, the Tower of Babel, of man attempting to make himself into a god.
Can I push back on that? I don't think it is. I just think because I agree with what you're saying, but I don't think that's the push. I think the push is because science is easy. You can take science and then go into science fiction. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Because you take something... remember I told you about the molds taking over animals and taking over, like, an ant. So what if that you make a horror movie like that?
What if you could do that to a human? Yeah.
And you make there's an example.
Right.
It's not because we're afraid of science. It's because science is it's malleable to make science fiction or even horror. And I think so.
It leaves the door open to speculation.
Since you've done more reading than I have, I'm not going to say that you're not correct in saying there's this fear of science, but I bet there's part of that, because when you talk about the 50s, and Sputnik and all the other shit, I see the expression that goes on, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case, that there's a push here, quite a mass experiment, right? We're going beyond places where we have no control. Yeah, that's what science is all about.
Right.
Nobody does anything about benthic, going to the bottom of the ocean, which is another place you can tap for horror pictures.
Right.
And they haven't done that yet. There's a whole plethora of places in science where you can, if you know enough about science, you could do great science fiction and great scripts that are built on that. This is unfortunately a poorly written script.
Yeah.
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think it is a poorly written film, and I think it only, like, obviously the story that it's based on is only 10 pages long, so it's kind of unfair to compare a 10-page short story to a feature-length film, even if it is only 70 minutes or something. But I think the thing that appealed to me immediately about Long's story over the film is not just the fact that, again, it's much more pared down.
Sure.
There's not this, it really is a strange, it's much more of a classical, almost Frankenstein-like story. Again, it's focused exclusively on
more Gothic horror.
Right, much more related to the tradition of Gothic horror. But also, just in that respect, Long's ability to weave out a suspenseful narrative, she has such more, at a very young age, she had a much more accomplished command of being able to give the audience or the reader little bits of information to curry them along. So in only the first 2 paragraphs of the short story, you have the the way I ended up reading, I didn't actually end up reading the short story.
It's
but
a shame. I did start listening to it, and you're right. I think it's much better to hear the whole thing in a half hour than to sit through an hour and 10 minute, whatever the length of this picture was.
Because I couldn't find any digital copies of the short story in time, but I was able to find a audio recording,
which is a reading,
a production, but done by the makeup artist Edward French. He
sounds very much like what's his name? I can't even think. Go ahead.
The Academy Award nominated Edward French. He actually was nominated for an Academy Award for his makeup work on Star Trek 6. He also did makeup effects for Amityville 2, a bunch of movies. Oh, he actually did the makeup effects for Walk Hard. Oh, that's a nice little catch. But anyway, so it's a very well-produced audio recording. It's very appropriate, and it even has music and everything. So and he does a very good job of sort of taking.
He sounds like Orson Welles.
Yeah, in a way.
There's a little bit of twinge.
In a way, he does.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say. Yeah,
and he gives a very proper voice to Long's story. So again, so. As opposed to the movie, which, because it is this sort of standard mercenary product of American narrative film at the time, that means that we need to have a distinct protagonist from the get-go. And so in the movie A Fiend Without a Face, our protagonist from the get-go is this Major Jeff Cummings, played by Marshall Thompson.
What are you going to do now? Get yourself all involved in this business? Let the local authorities figure it out, Jeff.
Well, the colonel doesn't think it's that easy, and neither do I. Besides, who can forget the look on that dead man's face?
He's the guy he's the strong, stoic rationalist who works on the military base, who is just trying to get to the bottom of this mystery. He's just trying to get things done. Whereas Long's story, there really isn't a central protagonist to it. It's a description of and teasing out of horrific events. And the thing is that the story actually begins, again, like the movie does, with the steady deaths of people in the town due to some inexplicable reason that they can only say they died of fear because of the horrific looks on the faces of their bodies.
Right.
But then... but in the way she does it, it becomes clear that it's almost like the perspective is of the entire town itself. And that was the other thing that I sort of realized that that either you can't do in a narrative commercial film of this time, or that the producers weren't willing to do, or didn't feel like they had enough time or budget to do, which is this idea of really getting the audience fixated in a society and a moment in a narrative that makes the horror of something all the more palpable. Because whereas with The Fiend Without a Face, it's so driven by Jeff Cummings as this total rationalist hero that the town doesn't even really exist. They exist only at the margins of the story, and the way that they're represented is basically only as superstitious and ignorant farming people who blame the military radiation tests for everything.
They'll probably blame the death on our atomic reactors.
It's his fear of radioactive fallout.
We're not exploding atom bombs. We're just using atomic power for our radar experiments.
Sure, go out and tell them that. You know we're 1,000 miles from the nearest decent-sized city?
What a bunch of backward people. They blamed us for too little rain, too much rain. The blight, the beetle, even Mrs. O'Leary's ailing cow.
That's why we have to have an autopsy, so we can prove that death wasn't caused by radiation.
It's weird how many aspects of the movie are actually directly lifted from Long's story, but are done in a way that just completely undercuts the actual suspense and tension. So because like, you know, in the story, because there is no central protagonist really, so there will be a moment where a bunch of deaths happen, and then a detective from New York City is called in to investigate the deaths. He raises up a posse to go into the woods and try to find, because he comes to the conclusion that this isn't like some supernatural force. There's clearly just someone out living in the mountains who's killing all these people. And so he says, all right, we got to round up a posse and we got to go search these mountains until we find him. But then the guy completely disappears. But then later he shows up like a week later, and his brain has he's basically been reduced to, as the storyteller puts it, a gibbering idiot. Like
that's true in this picture too.
It happens. Yeah, and that does happen in the picture, but why does this make any sense though, right? In the picture it happens, but the way it's done is that, number one, it happens later in the narrative, and there's also, the way it happens is that, like, the character, like, what is the name of the character who leads the posse? He's Constable Gibbons.
Yeah, Constable, right.
And he's played by an actor called Robert McKenzie, and he's basically a competitor to Cummings' love interest in Barbara Grizzell, played by Kim Parker.
Hello, Howard. Come on in. Oh, this is Major Cummings from the base.
Yeah, I know. We've met.
Well, I guess I'll be running along.
Well, you've only just been here a few minutes.
Oh, just passing on my way back to the base.
Quite a roundabout route.
The new airfield extension covers a lot of ground.
Too much for Winthrop's liking.
It must keep you pretty busy.
Yes, there's a lot to do.
I bet there is.
And so there's this whole element of him just... So instead of him just being this ignorant outsider who comes into a town with this rationalist explanation, who just ends up being, like, the most grotesque victim of this force, it instead becomes this totally chauvinistic display where he basically just... He immediately blames Major Cummings and the entire military base and their radiation for what's going on. He doesn't have he doesn't necessarily believe the radiation is causing the deaths. But his explanation is that there's like some GI who's gone AWOL and he's just in the woods going around murdering people. Right. And so but there's no real tension to it. And I think it's because, whereas with Long's story, there's no ceremony about it. Like with, again, with the movie, you have to have this, like, scene where you have this impassioned Constable Gibbons, he's not really just fighting against the military base, he's also fighting for the heart of the woman he loves, who, Cummings is moving in on. And so, like, it's this whole, there's this whole over-dramatic, phallic, agenda to it that isn't nearly as compelling as the idea of, it doesn't really do the same thing of really situating you in the mindset of the town. Because in Long's story, it's necessary to get this detective from New York City to the town, because we don't know where this town is, but we get the impression that the people there they're not the type of people who are used to rounding up posses and going out into the woods and braving the elements. They're very comfortable people who like the way their town is. They like being peaceful and neighborly with each other. It's just not in their nature. So with the movie, with the movie, on the other hand, you get this absurdity that we instantly started cracking up over, because so you have Constable Gibbons, who is basically just the only person in this town who wants to round up a posse and try to find out what's going on. And it takes very little for him to actually round up the posse, but as soon as he does it, so number one is like he's the only person in this town who seems to be below the age of 45. Every other extra and major player representing a town person in this movie is so goddamn old. It doesn't seem like there's any actual young people in this town, but none of them have guns. So after he's round up the posse, he goes to the back of his car, and he has like 7 shotguns, all of the same make and model, and he's just handing them out. And luckily the extras seem to do a pretty good job of performing like you just had a bunch of guns in your car,
right?
And we were immediately speculating, because again it becomes this thing where the movie itself is suddenly much less interesting than the implied backstory of this character, where instantly we're thinking this guy has been waiting his entire life for this moment. Because if the guns are all of the same make and model, that implies that he bought like 7 guns on one day. Right. And like again, what was he gonna use them for if this situation never arose? And so you get it. So like, yeah, there's all.
Here's that thing I want to ask you though. It doesn't make any sense. Even in Long's short story, these brains are, or whatever it is, even the thought.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. In
killing...
Long Story, the monsters never become visible, and so we technically don't know what they are.
But the point is that they kill the victims. But why, in both stories, why have one guy go crazy? I don't quite get that. And then it just the guy, the detective becomes crazy, or wherever he's the constable.
Yeah.
But that's the end of the plot. It's like it's a non sequitur. It just comes in. You see what?
Well, here's the thing, and this is another example of where the Fiend Without a Face doesn't appreciate how Long is structuring the story. Because, all right, so number one, you have to remember, we have to disaggregate Long's short story from the movie. The reason Long is telling that, so as far as the explanation, why is it that all these other people, when they come into contact with this mental vampire, this terror, right, as it's called, why is it that they all seem to just die?
Get killed.
But this one man out of all of them, he just escapes, but he's been driven totally nuts. And I think, obviously there's no literal explanation where it's like, or there's a very basic one, which is just, he just got away in time. Like, for somehow
why is he dead? Why is he nuts?
Because he got away before they could before the mental vampire could drain his entire psychological essence and kill him. Right. He got away. And I think one of the implications might be is that because not Gibson in the short story, because he is an outsider and because he does not have a supernatural explanation, he's not susceptible to this terror in the same way as the townspeople, so he is able to, despite the fact that he's terribly, his brain is mutilated by contact with the thing, he's able to escape sheerly by virtue of his own strength. So you think that's what
he did? He ripped it off somehow?
Yeah, I think in the short story, him surviving illustrates a very important thing, both narratively and thematically. And one of those things is
he's an outsider.
Yeah, but the thought monsters are not all powerful. They are discrete. It could not just. That's the other thing. It's not necessarily multiple monsters. It's a thought monster, one terror that can be at any place at any time, but is a discrete being that isn't necessarily all powerful. So it becomes this thing where in the story there becomes this ambivalence between, okay, how much of this terror that is striking the town is a distinct result of this monster, and how much of it is being built up in the psychology of the people in the town.
Right.
So there's this. So there again, it's like the gothic horror thing. The focus isn't so much on the monster itself; it's on monstrosity of how one event, like a couple of kids dying in the woods, and no one really having an explanation for it can set off this
Right.
this domino
It's
effect
a paranoia.
of a paranoia
Right.
and a collective
Right.
delusion that sweeps the town.
Mass hysteria.
Right, a mass hysteria. But then later in the story, so this gets even better. So whereas Major Cummings in the movie is this sober, stoic military man who always has a rationalist explanation, the Cummings in the short story is another outsider, but he is actually a supernaturalist. He's the one who comes in and says, this is not a killer.
Well, he says, but good.
Yeah, this is a
But Cummings does say maybe the supernatural when he's talking to the doctor.
Right.
The guy who actually created
Yeah. In the movie,
he
but
says that.
in the movie,
He doesn't mean it.
Yeah, he doesn't mean it. He just, like, in the movie, he only knows that, okay, this Walgate guy experiments with, supernaturalism and superstition, and he's kind of an unorthodox scientist.
Right.
But it's just like pieces of empirical evidence that are leading him to the preposterous conclusion, but it's in a way that he, as an empirically rational person, can accept. Whereas Cummings in the short story, he's immediately the one who says, all right, what you need to do is we need to have everyone in the town hang these violet lights in their windows, because this is going to keep the monster away. Again, no one ever explains why violet lights are going to keep away the mental vampire. But here's the thing, it seems to work.
It's like a Van Helsing.
Right, exactly.
Comes into town, they got to hang garlic and...
Yeah. And that's the thing, that's another thing also that is also not in the movie, which is because this story is teased out over several weeks, perhaps months, implicit rather than the couple of days that it occurs in the movie. What happens is that after Cummings gives the people this solution, the terror stops. People stop dying temporarily. So again, there's this implication of like, all right, so how much of this is really the monster and how much of this is literally, and it's like literally said so, and I may splice in the clip from French's recording of it just because it's really good dialogue as far as, the characters, one of the characters asking Cummings, are you just prescribing a placebo? Do you even really believe in all this? And,
At Cummings' suggestion, the people in the outlying districts kept violet-shaded lights burning outside their houses after nightfall. The thing which we are fighting, he said, is supernatural, and our best weapon against it is the violet ray, which is highly inimical and sometimes even fatal to it. Look here, said Bradley, aren't you introducing a little too much legerdemain into this? I can accept a primitive force run amok, but when you begin to fight it with colored lights, I grow skeptical. Is this an attempt to give the people a mental sedative? Cummings only smiled, and the people went on burning their lights.
And so eventually it does lead them to Walgate's house, because they realize he's this eclectic physician. So then, all of this occurs very briskly in, like, the first third of the short story. So then, it's only then that we get they go into Walgate's house, he's not around, but they find his journal, or his book of notes, and so suddenly we transfer in the narrative from this generic third-person omniscient perspective to a specific fixed first-person
I see.
role. And so again, it's very good. Long is very good at like teasing out the narrative in a way that it disturbs our sense of identification. We don't know if we're supposed to be identifying with the town or with Cummings or with this crazy scientist. And Walgate's own notes are written in a rather realistic way so that they seem to be expressing like a character who doesn't always have time to write down everything he has, a character who is often confused and doesn't really know what's going on. And so what ends up happening again, and this will finally, I'm tying it back to what happens to Gibson or Gibbons in the movie. Mm-hmm. What happens is that they reach the end of the journal and they discover that Walgate is planning on luring the thought monster, which seems to be particularly drawn to him. He wants to lure it into a place in his house where he can finally destroy it. And so realizing that Walgate is apparently about to sacrifice himself in order to destroy the monster, they go down to where the room is, and when they open the door, all that is left of Walgate is this, again, another gibbering idiot.
Mm-hmm.
So in the in the short story, there's ways, and that little bit with Gibbons is foreshadowing. It's a way of saying, like, this is what is going to happen. And as far as Walgate, it sort of emphasizes the theme, which is Walgate is the person who has produced this monster in his blind pursuit of knowledge at the expense of all other concerns. And so while he takes a moral action in an altruistic action in sacrificing himself to destroy the monster, in a weird way, him dying sacrificing himself is too good for him. So what really is the fitting punishment is he does destroy the monster, or not. Actually, the author doesn't tell us one way or another whether this attempt was successful. But what the punishment then becomes that his mind is taken away. Right. This brilliant, the fitting punishment is not that you die defending other people. The fitting punishment is that you do this action, you have no way of knowing if it caused anything good to happen in the first place, and in the process your mind has literally obliterated. So again, it's sort of the same, but in the movie, again, the thing that happens to Gibbons just happens.
Right.
And then at the end of the movie, Walgate literally just runs out of the house in a blind attempt to try to see if he can control the brains, and then they just kill him.
You can't, Professor, you can't!
It's suicide!
They're my creation. Perhaps I can control them. Give Jeff a chance. Lock it after me.
No!
And that's the end of it. There's no there's no foreshadowing. There's no there's no metaphoric parallel that's being created, because there is no metaphor. It's now literally just a movie about army guys fighting a monster.
Right. It's interesting that I have to go back to the Forbidden Planet, where the intelligent scientist guy sacrifices himself to tell the major what's going on with Krell and stuff. Right. He's letting them know. It's really interesting. I wonder how many people read this short story and never really gave credit to the...
Yeah, that's a thing that I was definitely thinking, because when I was watching Fiend Without a Face, not knowing it was based on a short story, I was like, oh, this is kind of like the Forbidden Planet. But then you read the short story and you're like, oh, this is the monster from the id. This is literally what happens in the Forbidden Planet. A scientist...
Yeah.
Although, I think, what's
all you do is changing the setting to Mars.
Yeah.
But you're not changing the story. You're just changing the setting.
Yeah. And I think it's possible, but I also think I think in ways that it might just be a product of parallel thinking.
I believe you're right.
Because it's there's an ideological motivation that ties all these works together. And obviously, Long, even in her characterization of this Walgate character, she's not working from nothing either. She's obviously hearkening back to the classic mad science, tragedy, Frankenstein. Where it's so with Walgate in the role of Frankenstein, again, we don't really know what his experiments are. We know
Doesn't matter.
We know that but we do know that they involve electricity in some sense. So you have the theme of a scientist working in electricity and animation, and then producing something that is a part of him, but is his dark demon self that he needs to destroy in order to spare other people.
Right, and the singular thing relies on fear.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So.
And that is the thing. What it ultimately.
And if you let go of fear by screaming, it drops.
Right. It becomes disempowered.
Right.
Yeah.
It's very interesting how these. And maybe you're right. Maybe it's just the fact that the way the humans think, you get parallel.
Yeah. I think that's
parallel thought processes, and not necessarily stealing from one from the other, just the way it turns out. Because,
and that's the thing too, is that like Long's story offers no closure in terms of whether the terror itself is actually gone away, because you read the whole story or you listen to it, and it at least when French was reading it, and the production of the audio recording was very good, the music was very creepy, and he's a good performer. So I don't know if I would have had the same reaction if I were just reading the original story without any accompaniment. Like, right. I don't know about you, but when I'm reading something, the inner voice in my head is not nearly as well produced as French is doing it. But I think that what the story it does so well is, again, precisely that idea that this is not a story about a monster. This is a story about monstrosity, and the monstrosity of how, just as much as Walgate has this dark demon brother of his that he's produced that it now exists in the world. He's released it and he can't ever put it back again. Just like him, everybody in this society, no matter how genteel or neighborly or peaceful or isolated, they all have this dark aspect of themselves that it only takes a small crisis to unearth this thing. And so, again, you're left with this feeling that, like, there's a way you can interpret the entire story where there is no monster. It literally is just like a random series of deaths that are escalated by the fact that suddenly people are now, it becomes a snowballing effect.
They believe in it, right.
And I think and it's a thing, like, that was, after hearing the story, that's when I went from being just kind of bored with The Fiend Without a Face to being, like, actively, like, like, okay, this is a bad movie. It's not just that it's a bad adaptation. In comparison and contrast,
but it wouldn't sell, right?
It wouldn't. Well, that's the thing. That's what Richard Gordon, the producer, says. It wouldn't sell, and maybe it wouldn't sell. But we've watched a lot of movies that wouldn't sell. Like, I'm just I'm just trying to think honestly.
Well, it's true. Well, I don't know.
I don't think anyone was clamoring for Catgirl or Attack of the Puppet People. I think the economics of what is supposed to sell in a B movie always seems to be so arbitrary and fickle.
I don't know. Maybe just the fact. Yeah, well, you're right. Maybe it's fickle, but the idea is there has to be a monetary end to it. So maybe this did sell better. Maybe the idea is that once they catch on, they realize that some films pay more than others. I don't know what it grossed. I mean, if there's any information on it, but maybe that's to it. Maybe that's what's to it.
It was a double feature with The Haunted Strangler, so I guess it was produced for like £50,000 around there much. It got like $650,000 at the American box office. So yeah, like, it's good economics. Like, I'm not criticizing the economics of the filmmaking. But like it underlies the fact that, like, again, like, yes, a lot of I think we've done a good job in this survey so far of substantiating where and when there's, like, a clear creative vision that is going behind something and informing not just, like, a cheap or cynical cash-in, but it seems to, like, actually be an authentic product of an artist. But the fact of the matter is that there are still cases where it is just obliquely clear and gets more clear the more you read into the production that these were just mercenary productions. And unfortunately, I think that is the same with Fiend Without a Face. But I do think it pays to talk about just how mercenary it is. Because it's not just like the boiling down of the plot to being about just this typical strong, stoic, rationalist man. It's also in the fact that, again, you show the monster. Like, that's the thing, is that, like, like, you read the original short story, and that's a whole thing, is that, like, the only time in which the monster is described in a way that you could ascertain, like, there's a physical quality to it, is when Walgate is writing in his diary, and he's describing a time where he had a sudden awareness that there was this being sharing the same space with him, and that he could feel, like, tentacles over his head that were not material. And so, like, instantly my imagination is going to work and saying, wait, so is this like a humanoid creature? Is this like is it like a squid monster that floats through space? Or is it like literally like a shadow of himself? Like in a weird way, it's literally just the tingle that's going up the back of your neck. Like, literally what the monster is, it's just the physical manifestation of terror, which you can't personify terror, so it's invisible. But I definitely had this very discrete image of just almost like a hollow person, like just something that has no face and is just eternally standing behind you, never goes any other direction. It only follows, and it's always just a hair's breadth away, and the more you stand still, it just gets closer and closer and closer to you. It's a very visceral image, but then in The Fiend Without a Face, we just get brain bugs. Like, this is how the monster is, like, represented and shown.
Right,
and
right.
I think that's, I think that was kind of
And that's the
lame.
only, because the plot's bad, and because, not bad, but because the plot is weak, and because the whole script is weak and contrived, the only good thing saving it, at least for appeal, is watching the stop action.
Right.
And there are some interesting sequences, like how they actually break the board and get into the... They try to board up everything, right?
There's definitely some like they
spent some time.
There's definitely some foregrounding of like zombie movies in like know terms of how the like I'm not like there's certain like interesting things about how these brains, and again like Aliens, like the scene where like the brains they apparently cut the phone lines, and it's just like, it's like immediately we were making jokes about like, how could they cut the phone lines, man? They're animals,
Right.
Hello. Professor, what's wrong with your telephone?
Nothing should be the matter unless they've got enough intelligence to cut the lines.
They cut the power.
What do you mean they cut the power? How could they cut the power, man? They're animals.
I want you...
Right.
But so like there's definitely ways that these brains have influenced.
Cut the power. What are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Or like there's like parallel thinking going on.
And those are things. I think that's why Long Story is probably better psychologically, obviously, because you really don't know. But here there's no way they can do that for the simple-minded person that wants to eat popcorn and watch a movie.
Yeah, this is not a movie about psychology.
No.
Or social dynamics. Or to the extent that it is. It becomes, again, it's like, so again, we have, like, on the one hand, this degree of scientophobia, this irrational fear, if not of science in its totality, a certain type of science, which apparently boils down to, like, if you're literally just some guy pottering around in his house, you're the bad kind of scientist. All the good scientists are working for the government or for the military. Private individuals are always making monsters and shit that are destroying everything. But so then let's talk about the implication of now radiation. And not just radiation, because this is a movie that, like, it's way more, like, politically explicit. Because, like, just the experiment that they're doing, which is the radar experiment. Like, you have a whole scene where they're in this control room looking at a radar map and just seeing how far that they can project their radar screen, and then and they're just looking at the whole Arctic Circle and all of northern Russia, and they're saying like we can just watch them. We're just like looking right into their backyard, and it's like
it's contrived too, because the radiation itself. Well,
like I'm not necessarily.
I don't know. That doesn't make any sense. You can't tap radiation without affecting the entire population.
Yeah. I'm not necessarily looking. That's the thing. I'm not necessarily looking for an explanation of the science. What I'm saying is that like this is probably the most politically explicit that I've seen a film we've watched get so far, where it's like they literally mention Russia.
Look, sir, Siberia.
If we can keep this equipment working right, we can watch those Russians 24 hours a day right in their own backyard. We can spot any plane, any missile, anything that's airborne.
They literally mentioned this is the reason we're here. This is the reason that we have this strategic relationship between North American parties, is so we can spy on the Russians and
spy them.
Yeah, and
all that stuff we were fearful of Russia.
Yeah.
And they want,
and I guess it takes, like, it's weird, like, maybe it takes a movie from the United Kingdom to actually, like, put the cards on the table and tell us what this is all secretly about. But I think the other thing, and it's the thing that ties it back to the Quatermass experiment, which is that, just like with the Quatermass experiment, where you have this inexplicable, independent contractor, American space, rocket scientist, basically going around with carte blanche in UK, in English society, and basically, privatizing the profits and making the costs public. So there's that. In the Quatermass experiment, it was sort of clear to me that there was a sort of subversive representation of American chauvinism, of this idea of Americans going into places and basically acting like you need to be a client of our agenda. And here I think it's even, you see it again, but it's even more explicit, because now it's literally an American military base on foreign soil. Now you literally have minor...
I think it's a shared base, but I get
right. You have minor characters in the movie literally saying, like, you're outsiders, you just came here, all your radiation is the cause of this problem. Like, but even, like, minor things like the noise that your jets make disturb the cows and make the milk bad.
But now the cows are used to it. That's
right. Yeah.
And now it's not a problem anymore.
And that's where we get into the ideological underpinning of the movie. Is that, unlike the Quatermass experiment, which I think comes pretty strongly down on the side that, yes, Quatermass is kind of like a sociopath, or at least a pathological narcissist, like, he's only going to make things worse. In this movie, you have this very reactionary attempt to mediate the very real concerns that this community has, which is, it doesn't, and again, it doesn't just extend to the radiation. It also extends to their theory that, there's a GI out in the woods who's gone AWOL, who's just killing people. It extends to their idea of how are you controlling your men and determining how they interact with the people of our local town. Because, I don't know if a lot of people, like, realize this, but, like, I've seen army propaganda movies that are specifically about, instructing their military personnel, look, when you're off base, don't just get drunk and start chasing after women and harassing people in the town. We want them to like us here. We want to win hearts and minds. You can't just, like, it's like not an out of the ordinary thing, but also just things like the planes disturbing the cattle. And like you say, there is a whole meeting scene in the movie where the army brass is there, and then representatives of the towns are there. Again, everybody in this town is so fucking old. But, the farmer brings up the fact that, why did the cows, if radiation isn't leaking, why did my cow's milk go bad?
All I know is, before this air base came here, we were doing fine. Now you and these Air Force fellows tell us that it's not radiation at all. Well, maybe you're right at that. I don't know. But forgetting about the deaths, how do you explain the change in quality of the cow's milk, even the quantity? Let the Major tell me about that.
But then the love interest in the movie, who happens to be the secretary or the clerk of Dr. Walgate, she basically gives the explanation is that, like, well, yeah, the cows, it wasn't because of the radiation, it was because of the noise of the planes overhead, but the cows got used to it.
It was the noise of the jets that did it, nothing more. It frightened the herd. But I can tell you that the herd is normal again. They've got used to it.
Thank you.
And that becomes just the most boring and reactionary theme that then runs throughout the conflict of the movie, which is that it's now no longer about the very real and material threat that this base and its radiation plant poses to the people. It's now just about how are we going to get used to each other. Because, like, that's the thing, is, like, even the modest proposal that you can have a base here, but maybe just no nuclear plants, even that modest proposal, that's out of the question. You just have to get used to it. And And I don't know, like, what were some of the more reactionary elements that you think you picked up on?
But that's true. I mean, it doesn't matter. It isn't just the military bases. It's being next to an airport and how many places you can fly over. People complaining about noise, the decibel noise from airplanes affecting themselves, affecting sleep patterns. I mean, that's not unusual.
Yeah.
And remember, this is a shared base. Yeah, they have to live with it. If there's no explanation that the radiation isn't doing it and it's basically sound and the cows have gotten used to it, then, there is a scene where they're all looking up and they hear the jet going over, right?
Yeah.
So,
it's
like that's their, shaking their head
yeah, that's the thing. The movie isn't precisely unsympathetic to these characters, but it is kind of like, because even thinking about the metaphor of that scene, like the analogy being drawn is these townspeople are like the cows, and the milk is like their emotional well-being. Where the implication is that, like, and I understand what you're saying, where it's like, in a weird way, like, yes, it's a joint base. This is a decision made by their governments. They're not involved. There's no democracy here. And obviously that's bad, but they do kind of have to get used to it. But I remember even you mentioned it while we were watching the movie, after the cow analogy, the milk analogy has gotten over, you're just saying to yourself, well, the difference is that with radiation, if there is a problem, people will not simply get used to it. They're going to die. Like, the milk is going to stay bad. It's going to keep bad.
There's contamination.
Right. And as opposed to Long Story, where the conclusion of this movie is that, what do you know? The rationalist military guy is able to successfully put down the brain monster. And so then again, that's the other thing. This is not a problem which is uniquely the product of these American interlopers, these military occupiers. This is specifically just a unpredictable thing that arose spontaneously out of one of the by some quack doctor who's living in the town. So despite the fact that the radiation it makes the problem worse, it exacerbates the problem, it is not uniquely to blame in any way. And in fact, the military guy, he always has a solution which then allows them to... And again, that's the thing, it doesn't make any sense. Like, okay, so the radiation makes them stronger, so he destroys the source of the radiation, but then they just all die in unison, and it's like, wait, like, what... Is it so it's automatic? Like, there's no, like, lingering... Because presumably they could... Like, and that's the thing, is, like, there's no clarity of whether these brains, like... could persist even for a short while. They just all die.
They all rely enough. Obviously, they didn't become corporeal until remember when the boost in electricity of the lightning strike made him turn the page.
Yeah.
Then he got better and better at it, moving. Then he said, when I started to get the radiation.
Right, yeah, I forgot that part. There's like a power surge that...
So he said, but once your radiation thing came in, you built your plant and stuff like that.
Yeah,
now he's able to...
He's been
siphoning off the energy.
He's basically stealing cable.
But the point is, you don't steal radiation. You steal electricity.
Right, exactly. So it
doesn't make any freaking sense.
Okay, yeah. Like
you don't steal the protons or neutrinos that are coming out.
Yeah,
I mean, it doesn't make
again, the screenwriter did not have a functional grasp.
Quite get that.
But that's the thing. It's not the writer didn't just not have a functional grasp of how radiation works. They didn't have a functional grasp of how energy works. That is just like this is like you could replace this with oil and you would still have the same problem.
I know it does not make any sense, but it's all right.
But that even goes further to my point is that like we could take radiation totally out of the equation. We could just have this be there's a military base. The members of the community are hostile to it because it's made up of outsiders. Maybe, the planes... Again, totally modest things. The planes go overhead and they're loud and they disturb their animals and make their milk bad. It's a perfectly modest thing. You don't need the radiation implication. And even once you add it in, it makes so little sense that the only conclusion that you have is, these brain monsters really are just produced by the error of one mad scientist. Nobody in this military is to blame. Everyone can just go about their days.
I know.
It's like...
I mean, any movie that we've seen, even the case of Night of the Living Dead, It has to do with it, something passing over.
Or there's at least like some sort of acknowledgement of like there's something going on.
There's radiation from a comet, and that's real radiation.
Yeah,
you're being irradiated.
Yeah.
Or if there's a solar storm, and
right.
That's real radiation. This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You don't the plant doesn't give off radiation.
Yeah. And I think it's true.
It doesn't give off. It gives off power to
right. But the power isn't radioactive.
No, it's electricity.
Electricity is electricity.
Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it goes down to this thing, and I think it's that there's obviously like the logical absences in the story. I think it's not just that the story is poorly written, though. I think like for all the logical absences, it becomes illustrative of like ideological absences. With like the adamant, like the inability to imagine a scenario in which, like, because again, it's not like Long Story. This is not the story of a community. This is not about like discovering the source of a horror. This is like the most narcissistic. It's like almost like ready-made imperialist propaganda, where it's like the entire issue is just that. There are these small, ignorant town folk who are not prepared for like the rationalism and the responsibility of living in a modern, cold world.
Right.
Yeah, I think it is like a movie that it's almost like the ideological opposite of Long Story in that way, where Long Story is all about the unpredictability of a community, like how overnight something that is peaceful and beautiful for no particular fault of anyone can just unravel.
Right.
And that all of the conservative bromides in the world are not going to restore. Once you've unlocked Pandora's box, that's it, you're finished. Whereas, again, what do we get with this movie? Literally, the protagonist saying, "It's all over now," and that's where we come to.
Except the sexism, which is really
yeah. That's the other ideological veil. Do you want to just talk about like please will you try to talk about Marshall Thompson's character and what a creep he is in this movie?
Well, first he. Well, it's not his fault. The door was open.
Yeah, the door is like there's a scene in the movie where the door is unlocked and he just lets himself in.
But that's if you're
nobody locks their doors in Canada, so maybe it's not his fault.
Don't joke about that. The idea is that when back in the 80s, one of my guys went to Penn State University, and sure enough, the guy he was staying with, the professor, did not lock his front door, and this guy was from Harlem.
So he couldn't imagine.
He couldn't imagine. Now, you can't do that today. I bet Penn State...
Well, no one will do it today. No one. You might be able to try it, but like no one's going to try the experiment.
When I was a kid, we used to leave our doors unlocked. You didn't have to worry about people...
Yeah, so part of it is just a cultural thing of the time, yeah.
Right. So... But that's beside the point.
But but then he just like it's not just that like it's real. It's one of these things where it's like
even in Forbidden Planet, at least she invites him to come in for a swim.
Yeah,
says, "Why don't I bring a bathing suit?" What's a bathing suit? And he turns around immediately.
Yeah, like cool. Because the Forbidden Planet, it's like coy and cheeky, and like it's like he's like
it's
and
more palatable.
It's like it's out of the ordinary in a sense. Whereas this has the same problem that the sexism of a lot of these movies have, where it's so these are the parts of the movie that are so down to earth and not encumbered by anything to do with like the sci-fi or fantasy premise, that you're just forced to watch them and you're just realizing, oh, this is just like the unalloyed reality of how men thought about their relationships with women in those days and how you go about seducing them, which is basically, again, you just pester them and you just treat them like their time.
No one
and
got hit, so that's all right.
Well, no one got hit. Yeah, so it's like I don't remember. I don't think
he
ever.
Uncomfortable.
I don't remember. I don't think he ever did that weird thing where he does like the vice-like grip on your shoulders and force you to kiss him.
Right.
I don't think he ever says, just stop talking and kiss her. But I think the thing that's solidified for me is like, number one, Marshall Thompson's performance here is terrible. I'm sorry, he's a I was talking to you just about this when we were watching the movie. Like, say what you will about John Agar. At least John Agar has personality. Like, Marshall Thompson in this movie is all shallow.
He's pretty flat. Yeah,
he's just all shallow affect. But it just does a great job of enhancing just the kind of... just the weird, like, detachment and creepiness of the character, because at one point he has to go investigate the grave of someone who was killed by the brain monster, and so he takes the lady's flashlight, Barbara's flashlight, but then when he's in the crypt that he's supposed to be investigating and he can't get out of it, at one point he just breaks the flashlight in frustration, and I'm just thinking, this is a man who has absolutely
no... he didn't break it in frustration, he was pounding to make noise, and then he broke it. He didn't do it.
I think you need to watch that scene again.
No,
he's definitely getting so pissed off that he's
pounding with the thing, but I think he needed to make noise, and I think it then broke.
And he broke the flashlight. Yeah. I think even later...
So he didn't borrow it, he broke it.
Yeah, exactly. I think even later he refers to it as, I broke the light, not as in, I broke Barbara's light.
Right.
You know, so, like, yeah, no respect for anyone or anything. Basically, the movie only even works as a comedy if you imagine that the character is supposed to be some kind of sociopath.
No, he's not. He's not.
But yeah,
the plot.
Yeah, but yeah, the gender politics definitely don't help. But yeah, which is
well, especially the people, and everybody seems to be in on it. Like the
gender. Yeah. Go ahead. So again, just to make it clear to our viewers, I guarantee when you watch this, every movie in this town, a person in this town who isn't a major character is a geriatric. Every one of them. There are no young people in this town. And so you go ahead and explain, like, you know, the weird, like, almost like paternal fetishism that's going on with relation to the town forefathers and Cummings' relationship with Barbara.
It's just, the general himself, whoever is their major, whoever's above him, he's a major, so is he a general?
Yeah, there's a let's see, is it Sergeant Casper? I'm trying to, Michael Balfour? Yeah, I think one of them is Michael Balfour.
Who's the, Marshall Thompson is what? He is a general, or is he a major?
Marshall Thompson is a major.
Major, right. Yeah. So whoever's above him says, I'm glad to see you have things in hand and under control.
Yeah, like at the end. Yeah, at the end of the movie. Yeah, as everyone's just escorting themselves out of the house. Because again, it's like no one ever addresses. All right, well, I guess we better start cleaning up this. Well, actually, the brains melt away. So
yes, they do.
But they do leave nasty holes in the floor. They basically melt into acid. Again, it's almost...
They melt to nothing. They just
they just dissipate.
They bubble up and then they...
But as they're leaving the house, it's the creepiest thing where you have these two old men, one of whom has explicitly made advances on Kim Parker's character. Like, actual, like, this old, gross old man flirting with a woman in her 20s or something. And as they're leaving the house, they basically just, not one, but both of them has, like, some coy little line about how, like, you're gonna take this chick home and fuck her.
Well, Major, I'm leaving you in charge. Report back when you have the situation well in hand.
Good luck, Jeff.
Thanks, boy. Well, Doc, I hope now that we got this thing licked, you'll encourage your people to cooperate with us.
Well, I reckon we owe it to you, Major. And it strikes me you are setting a very good example.
You know, it's like that's your reward for... That's your... Again, like these movies...
I don't think it's that far. I think it's the way you do romance.
Yeah.
I mean...
It's the way you do romance in a society where men rule and they're all
awful. Even the, things like The Thing from Another World, the idea is the major character in that case, or captain, whatever he is... although it's a much better film because he's not really the main character.
Yeah.
He's sort of the interlocutor. He's sort of like the person that never really assumes...
Well, he's the outsider. He sort of comes into a situation and has to...
He brings people together.
Yeah, he has to
be... everybody's involved.
Yeah, he has to be a mediator more than anything else.
Yeah, and he does. So he's...
Yeah, Cummings does nothing nearly as compelling in this one. No. He certainly is not as compelling as his supernaturalist counterpart in the short story, who actually does seem to have, like... You know, that's the thing, is that, like, in the short story, there's almost this implication that it's just like you say, the Van Helsing character, where their seriousness about addressing and investigating the problem never gets in the way of their clear kind of joy or sort of giddiness at being able to push beyond the veil of what seems to be the real world. But yeah, like Cummings' character in this, he's just again, he's the most stock of all the stock male protagonists that we've ever come across.
Really, well, again, the script is not that good. Yeah, so that's the reason.
But yeah, but it attains a special level of grotesquerie.
Right.
All right.
Good.
What have we learned today, Rocco?
Man's really a bad...
Yeah, man is... the true monster is man.
He's a bad monster.
Yeah, he is a bad monster, especially to women. I don't know if... I think it's stretching it, but Gibbons does do... Like, I guess, rounding up a posse and lynching people is still technically illegal in certain parts of North America.
You have to be deputized.
But But he is a constable, so he is deputized. Damn it. Damn it, crime... There's no crime to not pay in this movie. It's like, oh, no. Damn it. But, yeah, like...
All right.
Yeah. All right.
We're good?
I think we're going to close it out for now. Next week, though, we're going to keep going on our bad brain bender.
What's next week?
Donovan's brain.
Oh.
You ready for Donovan's brain?
I think so. I haven't seen that in a while.
Yeah, I'm currently reading the book. And I'll lend it to you after I've finished.
I can't have time. That's right.
It's a breeze. It really is a breeze.
Right.
It's written by Kurt Siodmak. The book itself has been adapted 3 different times. We're going to be talking about
Who stars in that? Diamonds Rain. Who is the star? Let me just make
sure. Which version? It's been adapted like
1958.
Yeah, that'll be it. Yeah, it's been adapted like 3 times, and Kurt Siodmak, who wrote it, directed the 3rd adaptation. But we're going to be going with the 2nd one because it seems like the most popular one. But yeah, we'll definitely
1953.
1953. Oh yeah, so an early one, an early example of these.
Who airs? Who's the monster? Who's the guy?
Who plays Donovan's brain? I think it's a prop.
Lon Chaney's in it too.
He's probably playing Oh, he did not play the Shrat role. Well, that was a get that they didn't capitalize upon. Who's Lon Chaney playing? I don't see his name in the... Wait, are you thinking of a... You're thinking of a different adaptation?
No, I'm looking at Diamond's Brain, 1953.
Okay. Where's Lon Chaney in this?
Well, let me see.
All right, folks, we're going to research the next episode. Thank you for joining us again on Monster Craze Memoirs.
You're right, he's not in it.